So let's pause and take it all the way back to the birth of environmental insurance, because I mean, really, that occurred in the 80s. So you've really seen and been a part of the evolution of environmental insurance from the beginning. So talk to us about the birth and inception of what really predicated the need for environmental insurance from the beginning, and then what that evolution has looked like over the course of time since inception.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe just a little bit of perspective to kind of set up the conversation. Liability policies insure against some kind of negligent act, and there's got to be some law that is tying in the liability or creating the scheme of liability. Perhaps that's case law, perhaps that's contract law, or it's statute. With environmental matters, what created the scheme of liability would be statute. So that would be the promulgation of RECRA or CERCLA in the late 70s to 80s. And then, of course, all of the subsequent amendments there, too. So there was already this structure in place to attach and allocate liability to an entity. And after a couple of years, some companies realized that they were starting to receive claims that were now citing statute that had recently been promulgated. And the insurance industry noticed a need and then set out to create a product that would fit that demand. What really gave the environmental insurance marketplace legs was ISO's recommendation for the total pollution exclusion in the general liability policy in 1986.
Okay.
Once you had all of the carriers start to take up that recommendation and include those total pollution exclusions in their policy, whether they used an ISO form or a proprietary form, that's when you had the environmental insurance market that had already been created a couple of years prior to, that all of a sudden started to pick up steam. And it's evolved into what we have now, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
What have been some of the challenges you've seen over the last 30 plus years in the environmental industry?
Changing regulations, that's something that's always going to affect us. So, for example, we've talked about it in other encounters. The issue of PFAS is now starting to create some concern, some significant concern right now, because we are anxiously anticipating promulgation of action levels by the EPA. Once that happens, you'll see a number of suits or a number of allegations of liability that are all tied to PFAS. Some other things, mold. So mold, originally when I started in environmental insurance, they would use the moniker mold is gold. Obviously from the perspective of plaintiff attorneys, because it was definitely scary to property owners that had a mold exposure. But it did create some opportunities for environmental insurance to start to fit that need. If we're looking at mold in particular, you fast forward now, and carriers are now starting to ratchet down the type and extent of coverage that they will offer specific to mold risks. For example, hospitality, finding coverage for mold on hospitality risks like hotels is becoming increasingly more difficult. Or based on where your hotel may be located, for example, if it's within a mile of a coast, again, that's becoming much more difficult to secure meaningful coverage.
What about climate change? I mean, I know climate change that's such a loaded two-word concept, and there's so much there, but from sea level rise to new extreme heat to changes and trends of major disasters and secondary perils and wildfires and floods, I know that so much of what we're seeing in terms of climate change trends in the United States and honestly worldwide is having a significant impact, has to, on, even if it's on the insurance radar of how they're doing their risk modeling. For, like you said, sometimes environmental insurance is for what's to happen in the future, not for what's happened in the past. But What are some of the places that you know climate change is going to impact the environmental insurance, and are you already seeing it?
Yeah, so I'll answer that backwards.
Okay.
Are we already seeing that? To be honest, not really. Where I think it's going to start affecting some of our policyholders would be those that carry a site pollution policy. For example, when you have sea level rise and you've got certain storm events, especially if you have sea level rise and you're located along the coast with a storm event and perhaps a high tide or a king tide, now you've got significant flooding. And if that flooding starts to enter commercial buildings, soak into some of the wood or the drywall or even furniture, you've now got a water intrusion exposure that could result in mold. Another example could be, for example, if you have large quantities of material that are stockpiled on a site and you have flooding incidents, there might be some kind of contamination of that material on your property, rendering its use not appropriate for whatever the purpose might be. For example, if you have stockpiled 2x4s and now you've got water that intrudes into that wood, perhaps you can't use it as a building material. Or there's some other residual contaminant in that flood water that now makes that building material unusable. Or you could have an underground storage tank and now you've got perhaps some water intrusion that comes in through the top, where you've got some other mechanism that causes a release from a tank or other chemical storage area. All of those situations could start creating pollution conditions. As of now, there are no restrictions or exclusions that are endemic within the standard policy forms, the standard site pollution forms. But I can see that being integrated into underwriter guidelines in the future, especially if you're in certain high-risk areas that might receive some kind of excess flood risk, or along the coasts, perhaps along the Gulf, or the lowlands of the southeastern United States.